we're here at Grant's tomb. This is the final resting place of Ulysses S. Grant and his wife, Julia. Well, the UK actually had a very interesting role during the American Civil War. Could say a few things about that. But this is an iconic image of Ulysses S. Grant taken in 1864 when he was appointed Major General of all Union forces. And he actually had started out what was called out west. He had a number of successes, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. And he's actually brought east to go up against the major Confederate general at the time, General Robert E. Lee. We now know the conclusion of the war. The war would really be ended, or seen as really ending, with General Robert E. Lee. This is one of many paintings that were done. Robert E. Lee surrendering his army at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. And often in the history books, this is you'll see an image of something of this sort, of Lee's surrender, and that sort of concludes the chapter on the Civil War. This is Robert E. Lee's aide-de-camp, and there are a number of figures here. This is Philip Sheridan here. There's a bust of him down below in the crypt. A sign that after the war, Grant is really the preeminent Civil War, or really the preeminent military hero of the 19th century. And he is propelled into the White House as the 18th President of the United States. He was elected in 1868, so just a few years after the war. It's considered the first election after the Civil War. And he has no political experience. Some actually said that he was maybe seemed like an unlikely choice, but again, he was just this revered figure, and he was seen as really someone they could trust. He serves 2 terms as president, and he provided stability at a really difficult time. There was just a tremendous amount of resentment on both the North and the South side. This war had just really been a catastrophic war. It claimed about 1% of the total population either killed directly in battle or died later through disease. It's just an incredible figure. We've never come close to that with any of our other wars. One of his greatest achievements, he's a big promoter and then signer of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. The 15th Amendment ensures voting rights for African American men. That was a huge achievement, and one that he really felt that was deserving of African Americans, and one that he felt obliged to enforce, and he did enforce it. There was he was actually applying both the federal troops, which were still stationed in the South, to ensure the civil rights of African Americans. And he also was using the Justice Department, which had just recently been created. Recent years have really been giving him more credit for really kind of being the first civil rights president. But moving right along, this is to fast forward towards the end of Grant's life. This was taken the last month or so of his life, when the family took Grant. Grant was diagnosed the year before. This was taken in 1885. The year before, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. He was a big smoker, cigar smoker, and he was diagnosed with, it was pretty dire. From there was really nothing they could do, and he knew he was running out of time. And people had encouraged Grant to write his memoirs, and he sort of didn't take it very seriously. But now suddenly the idea was, if he could write his memoirs, this would be really the last chance he would have. And then also, he was involved in kind of an early Wall Street scam that really fleeced him and his family out of really everything. And so the hope was, if the memoirs, which there was a lot of interest for, could sell well, it could leave something for his family, particularly his wife. He was very concerned about his wife. Having trouble breathing at this point, and so they take him upstate New York at Saratoga Springs, about just north of Saratoga Springs, to this cottage. It actually still exists today. It's called Grant's Cottage. It's a state historic site. And they thought the cooler mountain air would be easier for him, which it was. And this is where the family, surrounded around by the family, this is actually where he completed his memoirs. This is actually a picture of him, one of the last photos of him. He's here seated. At this point, the tumor actually was so large that he couldn't lay back. It would put too much pressure on his throat. So he had to sleep sitting up, and he had the terrible chills. He has this, like this wool shawl on. And here he is working away on his memoirs. And he actually would complete his memoirs and die less than a week later. So it really was a race against time. Incidentally, his memoirs they're highly regarded by historians and lay people alike. Very vivid memory of the war. well, not only of the war, but really of his life up until the end of the Civil War. Probably there was meant to be another volume, but he just ran out of time. But really interesting, sort of very matter-of-fact kind of language, very simple language, but very engaging. Grant, I didn't mention this, but the last 4 years of Grant's life, him and his wife live here in New York, so that's the New York connection. He was a Midwesterner, so his connection to New York comes late. When he dies, this is actually a photograph of him lying in state down at City Hall, about 7 miles from here. A huge funeral was planned for him, starting at City Hall and coming up. This is a photograph taken downtown on Broadway, and you could just see there huge crowds of people over 1 million people observed the funeral. And Grover Cleveland was the president at the time. His whole cabinet was here. All of the Supreme Court justices was here, and it said that most of Congress was here. So this was a huge event. All the papers described actually afterwards that despite the huge crowds of people, it was kind of this eerie silence as Grant's remains would come up. It was a certain there was a stillness in the air. People were just paying their respects to Grant, despite just sort of the standing room only situation here. Grant is taken to the site of the tomb, and the tomb wasn't there, of course, but this temporary tomb was constructed within 10 days or so of his death, and this is actually where his remains were and would stay actually for 12 years. Right after his death, a group was organized, the Grant Monument Association, and it was a private fundraising effort, and they raised the money for the tomb. It was actually one of the largest it was actually the largest privately raised money of its kind at the time. This is an early drawing of the tomb, dated in 1890, and it was the architect was John Duncan was his name, pretty prominent architect. And the tomb that you see today is more or less conforms to this early drawing, except there were some elaborate statuary design out front that was never completed, including an equestrian statue, a very large equestrian statue of Grant that was never completed. This is a photograph around 1896, the construction, really the final year of construction. The last 6 years, so I mentioned it was 12 years it took to build the tomb. Those first 6 years or so was a lot of effort was put into the fundraising. There was 5 or 6 years of intense construction, at which time anywhere between around 300 workers were here at one time. And they actually brought in a lot of skilled workers that knew how to work the stone. The exterior is granite and the interior is largely Italian marble. They actually brought in a lot of trained Italian masons that knew how to work the stone from Italy to work on the site. So they had a lot of skilled craftsmen here. This is a photograph taken at Dedication Day in 1897. This is when the tomb was completed. And it was a much more festive kind of environment than his funeral 12 years earlier. It was really a celebration of Grant's achievements. And it also was actually a celebration of the tomb itself. That was quite an achievement to raise the funds for the tomb and to build it, all privately organized. Huge structure. It's one of the largest mausoleums in all of North America, and it's 150 feet high. And this site was also chosen because of its really sweeping views of the Hudson, as well as there really wasn't anything here at the time when the tomb was completed. It was all open, and that was part of the effect. The idea was no matter where you were in the neighborhood, you would have these really striking views of this tomb. This is an early postcard of the site around 1912, and as you can see, it's all open. Actually, there weren't even any trees here. So, and again, that was part of the concept of the tomb. There was also a lot of, we have some photographs in the visitor center and the front by the desk there that show the perspective from the river itself. Incidentally, this building that we're in now is right here. And this building was built in 1910 for bathrooms to accommodate the huge crowds of people that were coming to the tomb. It was basically, you might have seen, it says women's on this side and men's on this side. So it was really just a giant bathroom. The tomb is the most popular site, a historic monument in all of New York up until the 1920s. Just huge crowds of people are coming. And initially it's veterans and their families. And then later, even just second generation, people really knew the effect people knew of Grant's reputation and they knew of the Civil War. The first 20, 30 years, the Grant Monument Association, which ran the tomb, they didn't have any information on the Civil War or on Grant, and that's not a criticism of them. They just didn't really need to have that. People knew of Grant's reputation. They knew of the cost of the Civil War. The tomb kind of becomes obviously people are coming to pay their respects to Grant, but it's also sort of an unofficial Civil War memorial that people are coming, making a point, coming specifically to New York to see the tomb. Just to point out some of the architectural features of the tomb, you might have seen this in the front. As you're entering the tomb, there's two allegorical figures, and then the words, "Let us have peace." Let us have peace was taken from a quote that Grant gave when he accepted the nomination to become president in 1868, and that actually came to to characterize his 2 terms as president. Grant had seen all the horrors of the war, and he really wanted peace. He wanted peace between the North and South. He wanted peace for African Americans. I'd mentioned that he really tried to protect the civil rights of African Americans. He also was actually looking for a new, what he called, peace policy towards Native people. There had been a number of Indian wars prior, and he was trying to find a new way, not just resorting to war. There's a lot of symbolism throughout the tomb. For example, it's hard to see, but these are lion heads. Lions, going back to ancient Rome, symbolize wisdom and strength. When you enter the tomb, you'll see these twin sarcophagus or sarcophagi. The crypt area circular crypt area is actually modeled after Napoleon's tomb in Paris. So there was a deliberate attempt to look to past heroes, and so that was incorporated into the design. Probably the most impressive aspect of the tomb are the arches and the dome. There are what's called pendentives. There's 4 pendentives, and they represent different phases of Grant's life. And also there's these mosaics. There's 3 of them. There's another one off to the side here. And those were actually added in the 1960s. So both the busts and the mosaics were added later. And the mosaics depict 3 of Grant's greatest campaigns, military campaigns. This is actually the center mosaic that greets you as you walk in, and it represents General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, shaking hands with Grant. Grant was very enthusiastic to receive Lee's surrender. He knew that with Lee's surrender, the other Confederate generals in the field would capitulate, which they later did. Observing the ceremony respectfully. Actually, what ended up happening was that during the surrender, word leaked out to some of Grant's men that Lee had in fact surrendered, and they shot off some cannon, and there was some cheering, and Grant immediately put a stop to that. He was very sensitive about just further humiliating the South. Again, as I mentioned, the South was just so crushed and devastated. He was very sensitive to just sort of what we would maybe say now, like spiking the football. He didn't really want to just upset the South further. And that was really the position he took as president. He wanted to try to find a new beginning and move forward with peace. This is one of the pendentives that I mentioned, and this one represents actually his presidency. If you look closely here, this woman to the left is holding a palm frond that represents peace. It was a peaceful time, his 2 terms as president. The woman on the right has a cornucopia, which represents bounty. It was the country was really expanding. They had just actually Grant's first year as president, they completed the Transcontinental Railroad, which linked all the new Western territory with the rest of the country. So the industrial engine of the country was really starting to roar as well. So it was a really bountiful time. Also, this series of individual wood rods held together, bundled together with a band. The idea is that an individual rod you can easily break, but together, bound together, it's hard to break, and it would symbolize his strength through unity, which is definitely relevant to Grant's term as president, because really a big part of the Civil War was really to keep the Union together, the idea that it's stronger with all the different states involved. So, well, thank you for your interest.
Thank you.
If you have any questions, let us know.
The bonny blue flag, it bears a single star.